Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you all from here in Carlton, Australia. First, I'd like to acknowledge the country on which we stand. I'd like to acknowledge here in Carlton, we are on the land of the Wurundjeri people in the land of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all gather and meet today, and pay our respects collectively to elders past and present. My name is Kirsten Sayers. I'm a former diplomat, a former lawyer, and I'm currently the Chief Executive Officer of REDAR Australia. With me today, I have three exceptional colleagues, three people of action, like Rotarians, like all of you here today. Together, my REDAR colleagues and I work with governments, the United Nations, frontline agencies to save lives and build resilience before, during and after crises, conflicts and pandemics. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. If everyone could have your phones on mute, please. This session is being recorded. And if you have any questions, you can post your questions in the chat function. If we don't get to your question, we will indeed follow up with you. So welcome to the panel. How do humanitarians contribute to sustaining peace? As we know, in times of crisis or disaster or pandemic, coordinated humanitarian action is crucial to an effective response. But with so many actors and individual agendas at play, how do you rapidly build trust across different levels of influence to ensure people receive the help they need quickly, efficiently, and inclusively? Let's look at the global context. The Global Humanitarian Overview is the world's most comprehensive, authoritative, and evidence-based assessment of humanitarian need. Through plans that prioritise those most in need, it aims to fight hunger, killer diseases, we have some experience with that these days, gender-based violence, and displacement. The UN and partner organisations aim to assist 160 million most in need people across 56 countries and will require a total of $35 billion to do so. REDAR is one of those partner organisations. We are a partner, a very proud partner to 15 United Nations agencies. We are also the only United Nations standby partner in the Asia Pacific and the Southern Hemisphere. REDAR and Rotary Melbourne worked together. REDAR became a corporate member of Rotary Melbourne in March 2020, and it was my privilege yesterday to join one of my colleagues, Sharon, at the centenary lunch. Together with Rotary, we are united in our efforts to serve others, particularly in Australia and the Asia Pacific region, but actually globally, wherever the need is most. We are aligned in our vision, our mission and values, and both Rotary and REDAR were established by a group of professionals coming together and forming friendships through service and humanitarian action. It's fair to say, frankly, that we're all people of action. And as Rotary's young people at yesterday's centenary lunch foresaw, Rotary's next 100 years will indeed be contributing to education and to humanitarian action. So who is REDAR and what do we do? Established in 1992 as the Register of Engineers for Disaster Relief, we are a standby partner to 15 UN agencies, as well as other frontline relief agencies and governments. We're a member of the REDAR International Federation. We provide training courses in Australia and overseas, and very happy to welcome Ruth Martinez from Melbourne also to our Essentials of Humanitarian Practice this weekend at the Victorian Emergency Management Institute. We have some Rotarians involved in our next Essential of Humanitarian Practice in Fiji, and we also maintain a roster of technical experts. Technical strength, super experts. We deploy these good folk when and where they are needed the most. Now with me today, I have three examples of these exceptional people of humanitarian action. And I'm very pleased to introduce my colleagues Angie, also in Melbourne, Barnaby in New Zealand, and Natasha at 4 a.m. in Somalia. Natasha is a former Red Hour Australia board member and deployee. Natasha deployed to the West Africa Ebola response. She's also a Rotary Peace Fellow Award recipient. She's an experienced leader of multilateral interventions with a particular interest in conflict and post-conflict environments, and is the treasurer for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. Angie is an Australia Assist deployee, Red Hour Australia, and also a Rotary Peace Fellow. Her technical background is in gender and protection. She's an active humanitarian roster member and has had recent deployments to Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Angie supported multi-sectoral effort led by in-country teams of the United Nations to integrate gender perspectives into humanitarian preparedness, response and recovery. And Barnaby, live from New Zealand. Barnaby is also an Australia Assist deployee. He's an international development and humanitarian specialist who has worked for more than a decade as an advisor and manager of projects in the region. He's also managed projects on behalf of the Australian government, the United Nations, NGOs, and has recently returned from a deployment in Bougainville, PNG, supported by the Australian government's Australia Assist program. He provided the operations and logistics advice to the Office of the Bougainville Electoral Commissioner for the 2020 Bougainville general election. As you can see, my colleagues are indeed experts in their own rights with significant breadth of experience between them. Panelists, it's your chance to say hi to the audience. Now we're going to transition into the session. To respond to the question of how do humanitarians contribute to sustaining peace, we will focus on two key questions, the why and the how. Our panel will present different perspectives. Barnaby will speak from the perspective of government, Angie from the perspective of community, and Natasha from the perspective of other influencers. Moving now elegantly into question one. Why do you need trust in humanitarian work, and what is the key challenge to develop that trust? So Barnaby, firstly to you to speak on building trust with governments.
Okay, thanks for the generous introduction, Kirsten. Yes, I think the question of why you need trust in humanitarian work, the blunt answer is because often it doesn't exist when you get there. When I started doing international humanitarian work, I thought that as you would arrive in the country, people would automatically, trust the organisation that you're from just by its name, whether it's UN or government or, reputable NGO. And what I realised quickly is that in a lot of contexts, that trust just isn't there. So for today's talk, I'll use the Northern Syria response and North Korea, where Red Hour have deployed me. And in both of those contexts, what you realise really quickly is that when you get on the ground, especially in, for example, in North Korea, is that there's 2 generations or 50 years of almost sort of palpable distrust of UN agencies, of Western governments for the sanctions that they've put on North Korea. And a lot of North Koreans would see those sanctions and the actions of the agencies that I was representing as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And without that trust, you arrive there and getting access to affected populations is very difficult. And that access, like in North Korea, is just getting out into the villages. I was looking after a $200 million countrywide nutrition program. And for that nutrition program to work, there needed to be good monitoring and evaluation in place where you can actually go to the sites, go to the orphanages, go to the hospitals, go to the places where the nutrition aid was delivered and make sure, it's, doing what it should. And without that trust, you just can't get that, access. So I think, and northern Syria was quite similar. It's an ISIS-controlled area. When a few years ago, when I was working around there from the Turkish side, and there's a lot of distrust between the Syrian NGOs that are working there, the bombs that are falling on them, who's behind them, and where they're coming from, and having to share sensitive information about how they work. So I think, in a summary, it's that without that trust, it's impossible to get access and to work normally. And again, after a few deployments for me, I really realised that that trust at an organisational level has to be built, and at an individual level as well. And anyone knows who's dealt with large organisations, some people are easier or better to get on with, and they more in tune with the organisation's values than others. And sometimes it just, you need to prove that you're that person. I think the key challenges that I faced in both those contexts, it's about the costs that it'll have to the local community. If the North Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs provides me access to some sensitive areas where the malnutrition in that country was particularly poor, is that then going to be beamed all over the world in news stories saying, how poorly the North Korean government is looking after its people? Or do they trust me at my word that the only thing I would do with that information is to improve how we do our program design to get better results to affected beneficiaries? So I think when we're building this trust, it's at the government side or at the the national and subnational level about what cost there is to the country. On the other side of things, in northern Syria, we were looking after mobile trauma hospitals that were built into shipping containers and then buried in the ground with a metre of earth on top of them that would withstand barrel bombing. Now, for most donor reports, they want to know where the hospitals are, how they're being moved. They want to know the transparency of the project. But this is relatively sensitive military information. If they give these, GPS coordinates to me, what am I going to do with them, and who do I share with them? So really the main thing for me was to convince local actors that what I'm doing and the unit that I'm working in is apolitical. It's not allied with any military, with any other greater political interests, other than to really deliver the humanitarian aid of which ostensibly that we're there to do. And I think at a personal level, it was up to me to be transparent and convince governments and local populations that's what I was there for, and then make it a little bit easier for the next people who come after me to then build on that momentum of trust that's been built. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks very much, Kirsten.
Thanks very much, Barnaby. Ungi, turning to you now, you've worked in a range of crises and countries, and certainly with a key challenge and arguably a strong record of success, but you've established and developed trust where there was none, and very much with communities within the countries in which you operate. How do you build that trust with communities?
Yeah, no, thanks, Kirsten. I like to take some practical lessons from Red R deployment to UN Women in PNG. This is where I supported the disaster relief response following 7.5 Richter earthquake, which hit the Highlands region in 2018. Now, why do we need trust? Well, the effectiveness of humanitarian response at the community level hinges on access. So access by us, humanitarian responders, to swiftly reach the community in need, or by communities to access essential goods and services. So we need access to move our personnel, to implement our distribution, provide health services, and for affected populations to fully benefit from the assistance and services are available to them. Now, it would be difficult to gain and retain access when there is no trust by the community towards us, humanitarian responders. So the key challenge to developing trust for us as humanitarian responders in that context would be when the relationships in the community have been under a lot of strain, and therefore there's a lack of trust amongst themselves. And if there's a general lack of faith in the community towards the government institutions or institutions in the broader sense. So, which is the case with the Highlands community who are living in the epicenter of the earthquake, particularly the Southern Highlands and Hela province. I'm going to share a little bit of the context here. These are the economic engine of PNG and one of the richest provinces in the country, but yet the most disadvantaged if you consider how resources are being spread amongst the population, where delivery of basic services are not reaching the large proportion of the people. So before the earthquake, these communities already face persistent challenges to peace and stability, so which leaves them with a long-term trauma and mistrust among themselves. And since the 1990s, fightings in these regions have become increasingly violent. The outbreaks are fueled by a variety of issues. There's contests over election results, there's uneven development, over arguments over land ownership and marriages. So there's a whole roster of events that can elicit either revenge actions or payments of compensation. So these conflicts were intractable and self-perpetuating. The cost also has escalated because of the increasing use of high-powered weapons. And the traditional ways of dealing with these conflicts are no longer able to contain all the stress of contemporary life. So from the 18,000 people who were displaced because of the earthquake, most of these people have been displaced before due to conflict. So the same communities, they've also been experiencing high level of interpersonal violence, in particular gender forms of violence and sorcery-related violence. The Family Support Center at Hela Provincial Hospital, just to give you a picture, receives an average of 12,000 women each year with injuries related to domestic and sorcery violence. So generally, this is a country where 2 in 3 women experience gender-based violence. So even when there is no intergroup warfare, violence against women is an endemic problem. So these challenges I have mentioned are intertwined and contributing to fragility of the population. So we're looking at it in intractable self-perpetuating conflict. There's sudden onset disaster, there's acute development challenges, there's persistent acts of violence against women and children, and the earthquake put further strain on already that difficult relationships across the communities, between communities and the institutions, and further stretch existing tensions between the warring tribes. So developing trust was particularly challenging under these contexts. As we were able to gradually gain access to these communities, but there's a key lesson here where, and I like to share, where we need to be mindful not to unravel what is already a fragile level of trust. Outside parties, such as us, I think the key lesson here is we should really ensure that our support, however well-meaning, does not unwittingly exacerbate the very conditions that brought about conflict, and that we do not exacerbate the existing divides. I mean, the key takeaway for me was that there's no intervention, including humanitarian aid, that is ever truly conflict neutral. So, I mean, I will elaborate quickly before I wrap up. In the case where community resources and relationships have been put under a lot of strain, in this case, the community living in the epicenter of the earthquake, having external actors such as us, international community, bringing resources into already underserviced communities, it would inevitably affect power dynamics and alter relationships between local actors. So when we deliver emergency relief supplies, for example, shelter, water, and medical supplies in a conflict-affected contexts, such as the highlights of PNG. And when these supplies were given to one community and not the other, then the reason behind these decisions had to be explained. Otherwise, people can feel excluded. And not explaining these decisions can add to existing grievances and can trigger violence. So going back to the point about building trust, yes, building trust and maintaining it, it is crucial as we need to maintain access as long as humanitarian needs exist. So I'll stop there now.
Thanks very much, Angie. Natasha, turning to you, you've a range of experience in different crises and countries, and certainly in your current roles, particularly as the coordinator of the United Nations Panel of Experts on Somalia, and also as a GCSP Global Fellow. Please share your thoughts on why we need that trust.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. And just to acknowledge that for me, my introduction into all of this international world absolutely came through Red R Australia. It was you and that organisation that really has given me so many amazing experiences in life. So a big salute to Red R as we're starting out. The way I wanted to frame the trust question is really to look at information and understanding. If we want to build trust with communities, we need to understand where the deficit comes from. And I want to give you two quick examples, if I can, on how understanding is one of the ways to build trust, but we need trust to develop understanding. So it's this self-reinforcing piece. And very quickly, let me give you the example of Guinea-Conakry. You already mentioned that I went with Red R Australia for the Ebola response there. There were clearly big issues and a lot of fear in a place like Guinea when Ebola struck. One of the things that might not be clear to everybody in Australia is this was also a very conflict-affected area. We know about Liberia and Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire that have had UN peacekeeping missions, but there had been extended periods of violence associated with elections, associated with spills of conflict across borders that made this a very fragile community in many ways. And to be able to really roll out an effective response where the international community was trying to support, to treat, to maintain safety levels with a really aggressive virus like Ebola, you needed to understand where the gaps in trust were. And so I think for some of the epidemiologists, I came at this with a conflict lens, and it was very quickly evident to me that if we mapped where the latest election violence had been, which was only some 6 or 12 months prior to the outbreak, if we really went and looked at the impact of closure of UN refugee camps around the Cote d'Ivoire border, looked at where the international drug trade was entering and processing in the country, we suddenly sort of started to have a real pattern of where communities were not trusting of government, where communities were not trusting of the UN, and where particularly the drug and diamond mining communities weren't trusting of anyone and wanted to keep people out. I suggested these would be the last places that we got Ebola under control. And actually it turned out that way. So it was really using relationships with people to understand how they viewed us and all of these outside forces that were coming into the world. And by demonstrating that understanding, being able to further gain trust to find solutions for it. So I think that information piece is incredibly important. Just understanding why is there potentially not trust there. And that really very much happened at the community level. And the piece that I would then maybe just offer up is in the role that I'm working with at the moment as the coordinator for the Somalia Panel of Experts. where I'm looking, even in the sanctions world, and I know Barnaby's already touched on sanctions and a lot of the negative connotations that there are with them. In the Somalia context, we have what is termed a significant humanitarian carve-out. So there are a lot of exemptions for humanitarian organizations embedded in the sanctions program to try and ensure that humanitarian aid will be able to reach people despite counterterrorism laws and other concerns. And in this context, it's much more important for me to understand the concerns of Security Council members and of neighbouring governments that will this humanitarian carve-out disadvantage them. I think Kenya has been the most explicit about this in that they would like to see Al-Shabaab moved on to the Al-Qaeda and Daesh regime because they think it's harder. And that would make a much bigger impact into the terrorist threat that they are facing. If that were to happen, we would lose these humanitarian exemptions. So it's been a matter of understanding what their concerns are, finding solutions outside of their proposal, and demonstrating that we will act on their concerns, so to build trust in that way. With Security Council members that are very concerned in general about sanctions, it's to demonstrate that this is not something that will be impacting on a nation's sovereignty. This is not something that would then potentially be turned against them in a sanctions program. So again, it's understanding what they hear when we talk about the humanitarian carve-out, understanding really where and how to communicate. So again, so much of this comes back to how do we communicate to the different audiences, and if we can't pitch that, we can't develop the trust that we require. But that was my sort of information take, if you like.
Thanks very much, Natasha. All right, we're going to transition now to the second part of the question, and that's the how. The how you develop trust, whether that be with the government, the community, private sector, other influences in your space, and how you do that work with other levels of humanitarian action and peace-building efforts. So, Barnaby, I'll look to you first. How do you develop this trust and link your work with other levels of humanitarian action and peace building?
Okay, that is the million-dollar question, the how bit to it. So I think the first thing for me, and I'll use North Korea as an example because I think it was most extreme there, is really to be an ambassador. And I don't mean it in the technical or official sense of the word, but I mean, I went into villages in North Korea and I would ask my North Korean military Ministry of Foreign Affairs counterpart, when's the last time a foreigner has walked into this village? And he'd calmly say, oh, I think about 1952, it was US soldiers when they were retreating. And I realised then that I'm sort of carrying the burden of, you know, not the Western world, but Western influence and how the World Health or World Food Programme that I was working for, and as an Australian citizen, how I'm carrying myself and how I'm treating other people really is the first taste for a lot of beneficiaries of aid from the World Food Programme that they've seen. So I'm pretty much it. I'm the spokesperson. I'm the country, the representative in that area. And I realised that the mistakes that I might make might then be generalised for the mistakes of that whole organisation, or potentially even every Australian who comes after me. So I think that was really just by leading by example and by being really clear on what I was there to do and what I could do and what I couldn't do. For anyone who's worked in humanitarian, you see a lot of suffering, and there's a lot of that suffering that you can't address as your organisation. There might be other organisations to do that, and sometimes, unfortunately, there might be no other organisation. So to be clear on what you can and can't do. I realised also, and this is true for northern Syria as well, that a lot of beneficiaries particularly, but even people working at the sort of periphery of the aid world, don't have a great understanding of the multitude of UN agencies, how they fit together, the differing mandates, what the relationships are, and also the relationships between the deliverers of humanitarian aid, let's say an international NGO or a UN agency like the World Food Programme, who I was working for, and the link between the governments or the multilateral organisations like the European Union, who would actually fund that organisation. So I spent a lot of my time explaining that the UN has a lot of moving parts, and the part that I represent, which is a humanitarian side of it, has humanitarian values at its core, and that yes, there might be sanctions and there might be bilateral sanctions from donor countries that also contribute to the UN World Food Programme's budget, and that even though there is money going to sanctions and to the humanitarian side, those two aren't necessarily in conflict, and that the agency that I represent is there for purely a humanitarian purpose. And when I'm asking for access, it's not for any other purpose. So it's really just that transparency. The other thing that I found is just identifying people with influence. Like any bureaucracy anywhere in the world, there were people with influence in the North Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs or other parts of North Korean government that I would deal with that were more interested and had more influence, and they were good people to work with. So it's like anyone who's had to manage stakeholders. It's really just finding the right people, making a personal relationship with them, and then with that personal relationship, again, pushing the agenda of the humanitarian agenda of the agency to say, we're here to do exactly what we say we are, and that if I need your help and your partnership to get us there. The other thing I found myself doing was briefing donors and other humanitarian actors on the local sensitivities of North Korea. There's not a lot of sort of institutional knowledge in that country, and explaining, I did a few briefs to donors about this is what it's like to deliver aid there. I've worked in plenty of countries and it's nothing like a lot of countries. So unless you can come to it with a degree of trust and a nuance for the sensitivities there, it's not going to work. So I think I acted as a broker between the two. I also made sure the agency sticks to its mandate, and that we do what we say and we say what we do. It's probably a cornerstone of trust anywhere. And the last thing before I'm out of time is just to manage potentially sensitive information and understand that to understand context, you need information, and how you manage that information, particularly if you don't see it as sensitive, but others might. North Korean example, just as from a cultural perspective, seeing people suffering and projecting that to the world might not sit comfortably with a lot of governments, around the world, and particularly with North Korea. So it's also understanding that even though I'm accessing this information, what I do with it, and to hold that trust and kind of build a long-term relationship is sort of what I was there to do. So that's pretty much, I think, my big ticket house. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Barnaby. And I'm also all for humanitarian diplomacy, so that all sounds very good to me. Ungi, turning to you now, how do you develop trust with communities and link your work with other levels of humanitarian action and peace building?
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. I'm going to draw on the same context of the earthquake response in PNG. I thought the lessons that come out of that response has a lot of parallel with other type of disaster relief in conflict-affected and fragile communities. So how we develop trust with the community in this case is from the way that the way we engage, how we identify and work through those already trusted in the community. And these are not necessarily through the established leadership, particularly if there was a visible absence of public services or government presence in the area, or there is that pre-existing distrust of the institutions. And how we engage with the community was through a group, what we called community interlocutors. So these were individuals. We had about 1,000 of them, women, men, and youths. These are community members from the hardest hit areas and warring parts of the region. So, and these are people with influence and good reputation in the community. And they were nominated by institutions with long history in the region. In this case was the church and also other trusted local partners. So most importantly, these are the people that the community already trusts, the very people that community draw on in times of crisis. So these interlocutors were the main vehicle through which we coordinate and mobilize relief assistance to the hardest hit communities in the highlands of PNG. And they also brought us one step closer to gaining trust of the community towards a broader sense of institutions. In our case, in this case, was us humanitarian responders. I'd like to share just a couple of challenges that emerge in the context as a result of the earthquake and the approaches we use through community interlocutors to respond to them. The one challenge was lack of information circulating in the community about the cause of the earthquake. And we recognized it could cause panic and rumor. So ensuring public awareness was crucial, but difficult. Dissemination of timely and reliable information was hindered by the remoteness of earthquake-affected communities and where communication and government reach were very limited. So post-disaster, communities did not have access to consistent and reliable information about the earthquake. These interlocutors bridged that gap. They helped analyze local risk and ensured consistent and culturally appropriate communications with communities. So this approach was particularly catalytic. I'll explain because reports were already circulating around the cause of the earthquake coming from sorcery practice. Women are a major target group for this type of accusation. People are fearful over unexplained source of sudden disaster. And if there's a lack of trusted information about the earthquake, that will give ammunition to accusations because people don't know how it happened and where it's coming from. So trusted community members in this case were in the forefront of dispelling that misinformation. Another challenge I will share was the earthquake, of course, as you would expect, caused uncertainty, which could potentially lead to even further mistrust, marginalization, and increased social division. So for us, addressing dynamics of exclusion of women and youth, not to undermine other disadvantaged groups out there, was also catalytic. So there was an expectation on community leaders in this context to provide material benefits to their followers. So a practice of distribution of assistance could be bound by anything other than the ties of personal allegiance. So because women and youth in this case are not usually included in decision making, and they have limited access to information and not being part of the existing patriarchal allegiance, there was a risk of unfair distribution of relief supplies and their immediate needs, life-saving needs, being unmet. So unless we specifically assess and address the needs of vulnerable groups with the help of interlocutors, they would not have been captured. So just to sum up, how we develop trust is by adapting what we do and how we do it at this level. The main lesson has been that we were able to reach who we could reach, the most vulnerable with the much needed assistance and protection, because the community themselves were at the front and center of the planning and delivery of the disaster relief. So I'll leave it there for the time being.
Thanks very much, Angie. Natasha, turning to you.
Thank you. I'm going to keep a little bit to my understanding theme, if you like. But the first statement is a really boring one. How do you develop and maintain trust? The big thing is you have to have done your homework. You have to work really hard in these situations. Most of us go in as technical experts, and that provides amazing resources to countries and communities. But our technical expertise on its own isn't enough, particularly if we're starting to talk about linking humanitarian action and peace building. In those contexts, we're going to tend to be thinking about long-term interventions. So we become very much, as humanitarian actors, part of the conflict economy, part of the ongoing process of a conflict. So the level of political literacy that is required in humanitarian action, I think, is really high. And it's been one of the challenges that the humanitarian community has, in that there is this very strong need and desire to maintain a political neutrality and independence of action. But that in some ways has also stopped conversations on political understanding. And they're not the same thing. We don't need to be political intervenants, but we do need to understand what the impact of our work is. And I think both Angie and Barnaby have already touched on this. How is our work being perceived? How are we shaping power balances? Because when we go into countries in distress, if there is conflict, power is up for grabs. And so many of the actions that we do as an international community, be they humanitarian, it brings money, it brings capacity building. These are all building power bases over time. And so we're part of that dynamic. And ensuring that the lenses that we do our analysis through and build our understanding through are not simply our technical area, but we bring in what's happening historically in a place, what are the political dynamics, what's the power balance between the private sector and government. Again, I think I've brought it up before, often if you're working in the UN, NGO, diplomatic worlds, you're surrounded by very similar structured people. We tend to look to what are the functionaries doing within the country. Now, they're not the only decision makers. Angie's already covered really well some of the community leaders and those natural leaderships that we see. But just to really underline again, the private sector in every country around the world wields great power, has significant monies and significant influence. And so it's trying to bring all of those pieces together. It's something that I worked with WHO as their conflict expert in the Middle East region. And so a lot of work in places like Syria, Iraq. And it was really interesting to see the credibility and trust that the organization could lose by making silly assumptions, by not really having examined simple things like border controls, what access to vaccines coming via various routes were there. If we'd put in place a promise to do something and there was an external political security factor that then blocked it, that was not often taken into account in terms of our credibility and trust building because we'd let people down. So it's not necessarily that each individual humanitarian actor needs to have every lens of analysis and every skill set. But what we really need to build into our teams is an ability to ask the right questions. And for our leaders to make sure they're asking these strategic questions on how things work, and that they're listening to the people on the ground to really get that nuanced update of how people are understanding and perceiving us. So I'd push that as my angle on how to do it better, and to be very, very aware that the international community is often seen as, I think Barnaby already mentioned, as the international community. So we have to understand and be aware of what others are doing, even if we're not going to be able to control that. But we need to understand what those impacts are going to be on the work that we're trying to do as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Natasha. We have had some questions, so if we just go to questions now. Firstly, Ashley was seeking advice from the panel on how to avoid trust gained being used or manipulated in unexpected ways. And I'm sure we've all had some experience with that. Ashley's interested in whether there are strategies or thought processes that the panel uses to mitigate this. Natasha, can I ask you first?
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. I guess that's absolutely part of the issue that I was trying to get to, in that we need to understand the motivations of others. And it's not necessarily that we're looking for negative motivations, or that we need to even frame it that way. It's really understanding that each community leader, each part of society, particularly in a conflict situation, is under multiple pressures. And if we can understand what those pressures are and what the needs of those actors are, we're in a much better position to deflect any attempts of manipulation. I think going back to some of the issues that Barnaby brought up about being very transparent. This is what I'm here to do. This is what I can provide. This is what I can't provide. Sets some boundaries that, again, makes it much more difficult to experience that surprise manipulation. Thank you.
Angie, would you like to add anything there?
I couldn't agree more with Natasha. And Ashley, I'm going to give you more of a challenge, because I think coming from a field level work, in my case, it's a real challenge of really identifying who are genuinely have that intention to support the work, and that serving sort of the most affected population. There's always some, specific interests out there of looking after their own clients in a way. So it is still a challenge really for us. But from what I've seen on the ground, just as Natasha is saying, it's really just what, in my case, is time as well. Just being there on the ground and getting to know who's there, and you get the sense of the nuance and what the dynamics is really like, and who's really around having that sort of genuine and meaningful influence. Again, as I said, not always those established, the ones coming from established leadership. And it was again, another challenge of the context with the Highlands, because there was a visible absence of these type of groups. So, just being on the ground for time sort of gave us that opportunity to understand the dynamics and the nuance, and slowly getting us into getting to know who we can really work with at the end of it. So it's probably a non-answer, but.
Barnaby, to you.
Yeah, Ashley, you've asked for what a good strategy or a thought process. What I normally do, and I'll give you a quick example of how I've used it in northern Syria, is really look at outcomes rather than activities. And what I mean by that is, as a resource mobilisation officer for the WHO in northern Syria, my job was to get money into the WHO from donors. And one of the sticky points we had is that the local NGOs on the ground would provide very little information of what they were doing. The donors couldn't accept being provided with little information because they needed to justify that their money that they were spending in an ISIS-controlled area was actually getting benefits for the affected population and not being siphoned off or so forth. So what the donors were asking for are the latitude and longitude, the specific locations of field hospitals, and what the local NGOs are saying is we won't give up that information because we feel that'll become a military target and that we will suffer from that. So I'm left in the middle thinking, how do I keep money flowing into the WHO, keep the humanitarian action going, keep it financed, but satisfy both needs? And the answer is the donors didn't necessarily need the specific latitude, longitude. They just needed to be satisfied the amount of hospitals that were in the area and the general area. So being able to negotiate that, to say, look, if we don't provide the lat longs, the latitude, longitudes, how about we just provide an area and say we've got 25 hospitals moving around in this area. The photos we can provide are inside the hospitals, not outside, because that again would be sensitive. Would you be satisfied with that? And sharing why we can't provide more specific stuff that we would in a natural disaster zone. The donors were happy with that. The local Syrian NGOs were happy with that, and aid money flowed. So that's an example that sort of sets out that even though the donors are asking for a certain piece of information which could very easily be manipulated in the wrong way, not saying that that was their intention, look a little bit closer about what's the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And if people are asking for specific information, often there might be a way to satisfy their need by not providing exactly what they need and finding middle ground. So I think the thought process strategy is always looking for that middle ground that satisfies both needs, but not being prescribed to by either party.
Barnaby, you're a peace builder and diplomat. I'm just going to put my second question to Angie. Shahida is asking, how should local organisations work with refugees? And Angie, we've got about a minute and a half on that one, please.
Shahida, thank you for that question. And I'm going to give you a disclaimer, because working with refugees really quite a niche area of work. As refugees, as you would understand, requires a very, very specific, and they have very, very specific needs, and it's not my area. But really, the key takeaway, I think, and it's still the heart of the challenge for us as the international community here, is really to create that internal capacity whichever context it is, and that includes civil society, to be able to manage that their own response and their own processes as well. So it really should be about, we should be looking more about engaging the civil society themselves, and to take the ownership and being able to identify where the areas of resilience are, and to find the solutions from within. So it's really for us to better embrace the principles of ownership, about building trust, in being more inclusive, including all groups, and understand it's not just the end point, but that whole process of getting there really matters. And that we need to see how we could support some long-term commitment. Again, it's probably not an answer for you, Shada, but it, again, with the particular case of dealing with refugees, is such a unique needs and situation there.
Thanks. I think we're all looking for those voices at the centre of a situation. And a comment we've received from Ian, he's sharing his view that we should suspend judgment to build trust and get the mission done. Thank you very much, Ian, for that comment. So if I think back as I reflect over the comments, the insights of my colleagues today, Barnaby shared the view that trust is not automatic. It really needs to be built at an individual and organisational level. Angie, ultimately the response hinges on access. So it's difficult to gain and retain access if there is no trust. Natasha talked of the understanding of the trust deficit. You need understanding to build trust, and trust to build understanding. What do they hear when we talk about humanitarian carve-out? And the how of our work. Barnaby, the peace-building diplomat, be an ambassador. Mistakes made by an individual can become mistakes, not everything that comes after. Angie, adapt what we do and how we do it, depending on the community's needs, and be dynamic to respond to those changing needs. And Natasha advises you really have to have done your homework. Technical expertise is not alone enough when linking humanitarian action and peace building. Humanitarians and leaders need to ask the right questions, need to be informed to have the right actions, listen to the people on the ground. I think these comments and these insights from our panellists today are exceptional, and I'd like to thank the panellists. I'd also like to thank the participants, and thank you for your comments and for your questions. It's pretty clear that we're all people of action Rotarians and Red R alike. And as people of action, we each have a role to play in building and sustaining peace. So I call out to you today to work together, to ask the right questions, to listen to the voices that aren't always the loudest, and together we can do our best work, building resilience, saving lives, and building a more inclusive and sustainable tomorrow. Thank you.